Good morning, everyone. So, just a very quick reminder. I'm Adham Saouli, Associate Professor at the Doha Institute and Senior Lecturer at the University of St. Andrews. I'd like to welcome you all in Doha. I hope you've been enjoying this quite rich and intensive winter school. And sorry, I'd have to talk about sectarianism again today. But I did think quite a bit about the best thing I could do to contribute to this school. And I thought I'd talk about my latest work on the topic. But I need to make a confession to start with, and it's related to the title of my talk today. I've never actually sat and thought about sectarianism as an isolated political phenomenon. I've always tried to factor it in the broader social and political and economic contexts, and the political phenomena I look at when I address my own research questions, hence the title of Factoring Sectarianism in Arab Politics. The only exception was when I was invited to write a paper on Lebanon and Iraq dealing with sectarianism. That's the only exception, and that's what I'll be focusing on in my talk today. Let me just start. So this is the paper I'm drawing on. It's called Sectarianism and Political Order in Iraq and Lebanon. It was published a few months ago, and I'll tell you more about the research question and my analytical framework. I've read some of your papers too, and attended some of the talks, and I want to apologize for not attending all talks, and that has to do with my other professional and family commitments that have constrained my abilities to come to this winter school. So thinking about the best way to address the topic, I thought I'd focus on the kind of research questions I'm interested in, and the particular research question I'm interested in relation to this particular paper, and the analytical framework, including a definition of what sectarianism is. I'm sure we all struggle in trying to define the phenomenon called sectarianism. So let me start with my research puzzle. I want to say that in the end of this PowerPoint presentation, the slides, I have a slide on other studies I've done that relate more or less to this topic, not specifically sectarianism, but broader questions on state formation, state behavior, state deformation in the Arab world, looking at several cases, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. So this paper is more or less informed by previous studies on similar topics. And the research puzzle that inspired the whole study was the following. Lebanon and Iraq are both considered to be deeply divided societies. However, these two cases have produced two different regime types: a consociational democracy in Lebanon and authoritarianism in Iraq. So to start with, you have this puzzle. Two societies, they're divided, yet they follow different trajectories in the 20th century. However, in the Ba'athist regime era, we begin to see Iraqi politics resembling the Lebanese constitutional system. So first you have diversions when it comes to these two cases, and then they begin more or less to converge. This is the puzzle I'm interested in, or I was interested in, and I began to raise questions emanating from the initial puzzle. The aim of the paper was to explain the roots and trajectories that led the Iraqi and Lebanese political regimes to first diverge and then converge. My specific question or questions, and this is where I related specifically to sectarianism, and as I said, that's kind of an exception the way I work. But in this paper, I did focus on the factor of sectarianism, whilst trying to address the main puzzle. So what are my questions? First, why and in what ways sectarianism has shaped the political trajectories and regime types in the two cases? And conversely, how sectarianism has itself been shaped by these trajectories and regimes? What does this central question actually indicate? That sectarianism can be a cause of social and political phenomena, but it also can be an effect. So social and political phenomena can enable sectarianism or constrain it. And I'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. Of course, I'm going to open the floor for questions in around half an hour, but feel free just to raise your hand. Let this be just a conversation. Don't want it to be a classical lecture here. What's the method? Generally, I work in the tradition of historical sociology. What do researchers actually do in this broader intellectual tradition that started with Karl Marx, Max Weber, Norbert Elias, Charles Tilly, Michael Mann, and many others? It basically identifies an event in history, a real event, a revolution, state emergence, industrialization, and then you begin to explain or try to describe initially the phenomenon and then try to explain its origins, causes, and effects on societies and individuals. So history matters in this case. Specifically, this study is a comparative historical study where, yes, I'm starting with a specific phenomenon and then comparing two cases. In very mainstream political science, this is what we call process tracing, where you're tracing a process to see how different factors tend to develop through time. Sorry, yeah, that's my research aim and questions. And I can, of course, send you this PowerPoint presentation if you're interested. And this is my method. Okay, what's the central argument? I will spend more time today discussing my analytical framework because I believe this could potentially be useful to your research questions and aims in your various projects. And I'll spend less time looking actually at the cases of Iraq and Lebanon, although if you ask questions, I'd be happy to address them. Generally speaking, my central argument centers on 3 points, 3 interrelated factors that explain my puzzle. How to explain diversions? Well, I started with the process of state formation and the trajectories this process initiated, triggered, and the path-dependent trajectories this caused. So it's important to look initially at the initial processes of state formation in the two cases. Why this is crucial to understand the kind of regimes that emerged as a result of this state formation process. So, as you can see, when I say interrelated factors, factor 1 relates to factor 2, and factor 2 relates to the third and last factor. In the second factor, two different regime types emerge: a constitutional democracy in the case of Lebanon, and control politics or authoritarianism in the case of Iraq. Of course, the argument in the actual paper has to explain these factors, has to link these factors to one another. Each regime type also established a sort of a normative structure. I'll say a little bit about this too. And in both cases, sectarianism as a factor was important. In the case of Lebanon, sectarianism enabled and, if you want, shaped the nature of politics and the state. In the case of Iraq, it was constrained, largely due to the nature of the regime type, but also due to the normative structure, specifically the role of Pan-Arabism and Iraqism as two ideological frameworks. By the way, the same framework I've used to examine the case of Syria, which is very similar to the case of Iraq. But here I look at two different systems. Finally, the last factor has to do with regime erosion in Iraq, which led, among other factors, to the emergence of some sort of constitutional politics in the post-2003 period. And this is where you begin to see the two systems converging. Or to be more specific, the case of Iraq was converging with the case of Lebanon. Do you have any questions so far, or anything that is not particularly clear? You'll have time. Yes, sure, go ahead. Yes, good. Okay. I'll come back to the normative structure when I discuss my case, but I want to spend some time elaborating on my analytical framework, which I believe could be useful for your own studies. Just by mentioning the words sectarianism, the concept, you still have to define it. And this is a challenge which studies on sectarianism have more or less posed. As I said, personally, I didn't look at sectarianism, but we have a flourishing literature on the topic, emerging in the last 5 to 10 years. And we had interesting scholars working on the topic. But still, as Fanar Haddad has complained, the concept and the phenomenon of sectarianism has not been defined properly. And he actually, in a study in 2017, he actually recommended that we permanently, and I quote him, permanently discard the concept. Before him, Usama Makdisi also observed that sectarianism is an inherently, I quote him, an inherently elastic and ambiguous concept. So we have this issue, this gap in the literature. And before them, Brubaker and Cooper's study also called us to abandon the equally controversial and overused concept of identity. So as you can see, there is some sort of anger in the literature about this phenomenon called. That presented a challenge for me. But it's not an unusual challenge, to be honest. I argue in the paper, quoting myself now, however, is sectarianism any different to other equally elastic concepts such as class, ethnicity, or nationalism? If the answer is no, then instead of abandoning the concept, we should exercise scholarly caution in its application. First, by clearly defining what sectarianism is, And second, by grounding its examination in specific contexts and time periods. As you know, in the social sciences, we deal with various concepts, and they're all equally problematic. As a student of the state, that's probably the most difficult concept, but still you have to, when you decide to use a concept, the challenge is to define it. You have two options as researchers, either to adopt a concept from others or to establish your own one, develop your own one. Okay, now addressing the challenge. What then is sectarianism? Developing concepts and analytical frameworks or theoretical frameworks always obliges us to come up with specific assumptions. In my case, they're related to my own research question. I've already identified the context. It's state formation and regime formation in Iraq and Lebanon. So I'm not interested in abstract and philosophical understandings of sectarianism. I'm interested in factoring sectarianism in these specific contexts and processes. Context, the two countries of Lebanon and Iraq. Processes, state formation and deformation in both countries. Clear? Excellent. What then is sectarianism? I have two main assumptions. When we talk about sectarianism, we've already assumed two things. One, the presence of interacting sectarian communities within a state, such as Iraq, or region, such as the Middle East. Now, the imposing question is, what do you mean by sectarian community? Well, a sectarian community is an identity group that shares common traits, religious beliefs, traditions, memories, or perceptions, which set it apart from other communities within a specific context. Okay, that's an assumption. I haven't gotten yet to advancing the definition, but I'm building towards it. The second factor, this moves us from the collective called community to the specific actors within it. The second assumption is that certain actors, whether individuals, think of leaders, sectarian leaders, or organizations, any political party, communitarian party, sectarian party, within these sectarian communities, they pass these traits between generations. Otherwise, how does an identity endure over time? It's usually passed on by individuals and organizations through discourse, symbols, or performances. In doing so, these actors, this is what I'm talking about, sorry. Oh, no, still here. In doing so, these actors reproduce identities and mark identity boundaries. Okay? These are my two assumptions. What is sectarianism? Sectarianism, I argue, is a social actor's, be it an individual or group, feeling of belonging, devotion, and allegiance to a sectarian community within a social context. Now, I just want to say I might not be suggesting anything new, but this is the intellectual challenge I had to face in working on this topic. Just for my own sanity, I had to produce a clear-cut definition of the topic, of the concept, sorry. I continue, the strongly felt belonging leads a social actor to exalt their community above others. Now, look carefully, and you realize that this is not very different from being nationalistic or a nationalist. or religious or any ist. Now, this doesn't tell us, on the other hand, a lot about the political implications. I built on Charles Tilly to argue, because if you see in this particular definition, what comes out is the idea of identity, belonging to some sort of an identity group. What's an identity? For Tilly, identities are social arrangements that can only be understood in relation to others. It's how certain groups demarcate themselves as a group. Also, social psychologist Stephen Riker considers a social identity sectarian or otherwise. What does it actually do? It mediates between social context and the action of human subjects. So identity helps us mediate or establish connections between us as individuals and our group, and also between our group and other groups in a specific social context. Now, you might ask me, well, what does this tell us about politics? So far, I've dealt with sectarianism as a social phenomenon, open for political opportunities, interpretations, and manipulations. What is political sectarianism? This is what it is. It's the mobilization of sectarian communities, as I've already identified them, specifically their emotions, their memories, their beliefs, their aspirations, and fears for specific political goals. What are these specific political questions? Things such as statehood, nation building, political representations, so when sectarianism becomes intricately tied to political questions such as national identity, statehood, or political representation, think here of Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Iraq, possibly Syria, then sectarian communities become contexts and vehicles to political mobilization. Okay? Yes, go ahead.
What is the difference between the political identities and the political sectarian identities as tools for mobilization?
Okay. Can you repeat that, please?
What is the difference between the political identities and the political sectarian identities as tools for mobilization?
They could be similar, but they could also be different. But here, in this case, I'm talking about sectarian identities that become politicized in the context of competition and rivalries with other groups. So if you're dealing with a nationalist group, say in the context of Switzerland, it's not about sectarianism as such, it's about national groups. Then when these national groups are politicized, they become some sort of a political identity groups. Here, I'm dealing with sectarian communities that become politicized in time or through time. That's just the basic difference. What actually happens in these contexts? Well, you always have two actors. One actor is trying to revise the political arrangement, and another actor is usually trying to preserve an existing political configuration. We have papers here on, for example, just to give you a quick example, from the Lebanon war. I think, can I call you Nate? Nate. I'll be discussing Nate's paper later on today. He discusses basically the origins of the Lebanese war and how it developed. It's quite simple if you think about it. There is a dominant group wanting to preserve the political system and other challengers, those who want to revise it. Call them as whatever you like, revolutionaries or terrorists. I'm not dealing with politics here. I'm dealing with specifically a political phenomenon. Syria. The regime of Bashar al-Assad was trying to preserve its dominance. Its challengers wanted to revise the system. Sectarian factors play a role in these processes. As researchers, we need to factor sectarianism in these processes if you're interested in doing that. So political actors may seek to either revise or preserve existing political configurations depending on their place in a political order. Are we clear on what sectarianism is? Of course, there is time to discuss these questions. Yeah? Any questions so far? Let me move to, I'm still also building my analytical framework. And if you're interested to know why I'm calling it an analytical and not a theoretical framework, I can address this later, okay? So, I continue. What is sectarianism? Now, let's remember something in dealing with sectarian communities, because this is my initial assumption, yeah? Sectarian communities are not monolithic actors. Like any social group, be it a class, be it a political party, be it a state, these are not monolithic arctic. They're small societies, if you want, with sometimes divergent or different political attitudes and perceptions. Sectarian belonging and relations are hence socially constructed and deconstructed. Indeed, my case study of Iraq and Lebanon, but also of Syria, also of Saudi Arabia and other cases, in these processes you do have actors who are trying to construct sectarianism, instrumentalize sectarianism, not necessarily for purely political reasons. Sometimes there's a group that feels aggrieved, a group that feels underrepresented, and it has to present its identity and fight for it. In a way, in the process, these groups are constructing sectarianism, while others might be deconstructing sectarianism. It's an ongoing process. Hence, identities, you probably heard this 1,000 times before, are malleable. They're not fixed. They're open for interpretation. But sectarianism, like nationalism, is also open for political manipulation. In some contexts, like Syria's past or Iraq's past, if you're sectarian, that was a crime. So if you were a sectarian, if you were, a Ba'athist leader and you wanted to get rid of your potential political opponents, you just accused them of being sectarian. Why? Because Ba'athist ideology is supposed to overcome these sectarian divisions. So sectarianism is open for manipulation. And you could give numerous examples about this. President Sadat of Egypt, gets angry with President Hafez al-Assad of Syria in the late 70s. And the discourse switches. Hafez al-Assad transforms from the leader of Arab nationalism to become what? An Alawite sectarian leader. The point was to more or less delegitimize Assad. But then Assad uses the same discourse with Kamal Jumblat in Lebanon. It's interesting, look at this discourse, how it's constructed and deconstructed, and think about sectarianism. So, building on these assumptions, on this definition, and on this further, if you want, dimensions of sectarianism, I then look at the cases of Iraq and Lebanon. Mind you, it wasn't as elaborated. All of this, more or less, is in the paper. But when they ask you to write a paper in 8,000 words only, you have to include all of this plus compare two cases. And then you get 4 reviewers who are actually angry with your paper. But luckily, they accepted the paper and it was published. For further reading, you can look at other studies I've worked on that touch on similar topics. And I've included these in the PowerPoint presentation. Let me say something about Lebanon and Iraq. I'll just focus on the main points and then open the floor for your questions. Why did Lebanon end up having a consociational political system, and Iraq an authoritarian system for much of its history as a state? We have to go back in time and establish what political scientists call these critical moments when an entity emerges and enters into a path, and this path becomes what we call a path-dependent trajectory. Sometimes when you decide to go to watch a movie and you buy a ticket, you might, on the way to watching a movie, change your mind. And you say, I actually feel like having a meal now. But then you've already bought the ticket. And you face this situation. You're now on a certain path that more or less the path and the decisions you've made shape your own destiny and trajectories. This, of course, goes on to marriages and divorces and entering into PhD programs. Then you decide, do I really want to do this? Do I want to be with those insecure nerds called academics? So we set ourselves into paths. In the case of Lebanon, in the mid-19th century, we had a social and economic conflict in what was called Mount Lebanon, between groups, initially between feudal lords who were interested in collecting taxes for the Ottoman Empire. But at one point, these groups feel threatened and they begin to mobilize on a sectarian basis. Maronites versus Jews. And given that the country is or Mount Lebanon is and was located in an important geopolitical location, the country was open and exposed and was vulnerable since then to external intervention. This mobilization sets the country that would become Lebanon on a specific path. What enters into the discourse is the language of the culture of sectarianism. Now you have groups, and these groups need to be what? One word, represented in any sort of political governance. How do you represent these groups? Well, first you count them. Numbers matter, and then you try to reflect this demographic and communal numbers into specific political groupings. And that set Lebanon on a specific trajectory. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire collapses and Greater Lebanon emerges. There's one important difference in the case of Lebanon. You had one group, specifically Maronite Christians of Lebanon, wanting to establish a state. This is an important factor. You also have the French who want to divide the region with the British and establish spheres of influence. So you have here a convergence of interests, an indigenous group plus a colonial group. Their interests converge and the country called Lebanon is established. Now this is important. Christians in Mount Lebanon wanted a greater Lebanon because they needed food, vegetables, and they needed access to the Mediterranean. So they included southern Lebanon and then included Tripoli or northern Lebanon. But what do you have in these regions? Predominantly Muslim regions. What do you do with these predominantly Muslim regions? You have to do two things. You incorporate them into the new state, but they're not really convinced because they're Arabs and Muslims. So why demarcate an entity called Lebanon? After all, that was artificial in their own minds. So you had those who hated the French and those who were collaborating with the French. And I'm not saying all the Maronites or all the Christians. Indeed, many Christians were fighting the French. But then you had to deal with that. And what is established is a sort of concessional system, where, to please everyone, you incorporate them into the state. And you begin to talk about representation, equal, between quotations, respect for religious freedoms, pluralism. And this is reflected in the state institutions. An interesting comparison would be with Syria, where in Syria, such schemes were rejected. And that sets Lebanon on a concessional path of state formation. Lots of advantages, making Lebanon one of the most liberal and free countries in the Arab world, but also exposed Lebanon to various international interventions and accumulated grievances. Christian Maronites wanted to preserve the state. At one point, Muslims wanted reformation, Muslims plus leftist coalition. Nate will talk about this later. I'll leave this to you. That set Lebanon on a, and that's why we tend to call Lebanon a weak state. We could discuss to which extent it's weak. And lately, we had some sort of revolt on this system. We could also deal with that. What happened in Iraq was a totally different trajectory. The way Iraq was formed as a state was different. We don't have anything called Iraq in history. But we did have some sort of three entities: Baghdad, Basra, and the north. And then with time, of course, you had some demographic divisions within Iraq. In Iraq, the British wanted to also establish a sphere of influence. What do the colonial powers actually want? It's quite simple. They want to control the spheres of influence. How do you do that? Well, you establish institutions. Police, you install a regime that's friendly, you want to extract taxes or open the markets, and you wanted to preserve two important things: security and the foreign policies of these entities. And having betrayed the Arabs in the early 20th century, the British were slightly guilty, but also thinking of strategic interests. They installed the king and established some sort of a parliamentary system. So the French established republics, the British established parliamentary monarchies. That's the system they know. It's normal. And the Ottomans did it before them. That's not a particularly colonial thing. You establish the sort of system you're familiar with. A parliamentary system installing a king, and then also you had an Arab nationalist movement emerging from the heart of the Ottoman Empire with specific of what we call Sharifian officers. These were Arab officers with pan-Arab feelings and belongings who were angry with the Ottomans and angry with Turkish nationalism and now wanted to rule over Iraq. Most of them came from Baghdad. And then these officers, in addition to the king, would form the main pillar of the state in Iraq. What that set in force started a trajectory in Iraq. See, the British and French did not establish states. They merely found the context for state building to occur. State formation or state deformation. They established what I call in my book social fields that trigger these state building processes. So here now you begin to have, in the case of Iraq, an indigenous attempt to build a state with King Faisal and then the Pan-Arab movement. Here you begin to realize also the emergence of a normative structure. In Lebanon, the normative structure was one of consociational politics. groups have to be representative, religious freedoms have to be honored, the system has to incorporate all, and this is more or less incorporated in Lebanon's constitutional system. There is no actual hegemon in the sense or as compared to control politics in authoritarian system. But you did have a Maronite dominance of the state, although the Muslims played a key role in that, Sunnis and later Shias. In the case of Iraq, you begin to have struggles over the identity of Iraq. Is Iraq an Arab nationalist country, or is Iraq an Iraqi nationalist country? As in Lebanon, there is a struggle between pan-Arabism and Lebanonism, if you want to call it. In Iraq, you had a struggle between the pan-Arabists and the Iraqists. And that was cross-sectarian. In that pan-Arab normative structure, sectarianism was not tolerated. Although many segments of the Shiites were excluded, but they also played a role in their own exclusion because they didn't acknowledge the British or didn't recognize the British rule of occupation of Iraq. So if you talked about sectarianism or Shia sectarian grievances, you'd be accused of treason, or you'd be accused of fitna. That's my next big project. Not sectarian fitna, but fitna in general. So, and that wasn't a Sunni dominant state, by the way. Do you know, for example, I'll give the example up and give you the chance. The first minister of finance in Iraq was actually Jewish. These groups, ruling groups in Iraq, identified themselves as pan-Arab. And of course, Baghdad is an Arab capital, always looked towards Damascus, culturally towards Damascus and Beirut. Sorry, I'll stop here, give you a chance to ask your question.
No, it's okay. Thank you for inviting us to ask questions throughout the presentation. That's really nice, actually. Can you explain the difference between sectarian, cross-sectarian alliances and non-sectarian cross-sectarian alliances? It struck me, the division, in the two camps, the Arab nationalist and the Iraqi camp, you described that as non-sectarian. In Lebanon, your comparative case, there's another rift, the 8th of March and the 14th of March camp, which are also both cross-sectarian. Obviously, they are being described as sectarian, but now you've been looking at the two countries in comparison, so I would very much like to hear your reflections on how we distinguish between them.
That's actually your paper, so I'll give more time. I read your paper last night, and we can talk about this. But when we talk in the case of Iraq of cross-sectarian, actually using the word would be imposing concepts of today on Iraq of the 20th and 30th and 40th decades. And it wasn't the case. These people viewed themselves as pan-Arab. They did, some segments of the ruling elite did look at the Shias with suspicion. And that has a long history in Muslim relations. The Shias were seen as potentially dangerous, and they continue to be seen until this moment. That said, Shias of Iraq played a key role in the Arab nationalist movement, a key role in various political parties in Iraq, a key role in the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, but also a key role in the Communist Party. Before they begin to start to emerge as a movement with the Dawah Party in the late 1950s. But during that process, there were interesting things happening in Iraq. Again, let's try to factor sectarianism and not take this factor as the whole cause of everything that happened or happens in Iraq. You had in Iraq, as in Syria, you had intra-regime fights. In both Syria and Iraq, you have a large coalition of progressive Arab nationalists and leftists coming to power. They topple the monarchical regime that was established by the British, and now say we're an independent country. Yet, they're a very politically diverse group. So you have the communists, you have the Arab nationalists, and in the Arab nationalist movement, you had various groups, the Baathists, Naserites, and others. But in both Syria and Iraq, you also had Iraqi and Syrian nationalists. Those who wanted to preserve these entities as they are. Abdul Karim Qasim represents that version, the Iraqi version. It's interesting. His father was an Arab Sunni. His mom was Kurd, but she was also Shia. So he's a pure Iraqi on many, many levels. Now, obviously, if you wanted to be an independent entity in that period, you were very likely to disappoint many actors. The Arab nationalist movement, which they used to call him isolationist. It's not infisali, it's in'izali. And that's what the Christians of Lebanon were called. And that's what the Syrian nationalists, not nationalist as pan-nationalism, but the specific nationalist movements in Syria. What happens during this period? First, Abdul Karim Qasim, let's establish some facts. Until 1958, you only get 2 or 3 Shia prime ministers, despite the significant, I think it's 4, but I'd say 5. Let's say 5. But that's very little. 5 out of 47. I have it in my paper. We can talk about it. So let's see. The first Shia prime minister, Saleh Jabr, came to power only in 1947. Of the 59 governments formed under the monarchy, only 5 were formed by Shias. Thank you, you're right. And the Shias' share in ministerial appointments was only 27%. So there is some anger about the lack of representation in Iraq. And if you express that anger, you'd be accused of sectarianism. Of course, if you were angry in Syria and you were Sunni and expressed some grievances, you'd be accused of sectarianism. Whether you were a Muslim brother or just a Syrian Sunni, you know. And then you have Abdul Karim Qasim with a nationalist political project. He begins to, although the Shias under Qasim were elevated in terms of poverty and et cetera, but then he begins to nationalize the land. Who gets angry within the Shiites? The landlords. So first you don't have a good or fair political representation, then the Shia landlords are angry because the British used to collaborate with the landlords. They didn't care whether they were Shia. They were landlords, they had an interest, you collaborated with them. Keep them happy, we're happy, and more or less everyone is happy. Everyone. And then the Baathists come to power through a military coup. And a lot of suspicion in Iraq, also keep on referring to Syria because you have similar trajectories. So you have a system where power is being monopolized politically, laying the establishment for a very strict authoritarian system, violent one. So the main civil war in the 60s in Iraq was between the Baathists and the communists. Under the Baath in Iraq, Arab nationalism ceases to be just a mere cultural idea. It becomes the religion of the state. I have to move faster. Becomes the religion of the state, and any, if you want, opposition coming from ethnic groups or religious or sectarian groups would be totally repressed. Who gets later angry? The Iraqi religious establishment, when the Baath begins to monopolize the ideological sphere, because Arab nationalism was supposed to be the religion of the state. So anything else is opposed. All of these approaches all of these developments gives rise to the Dawah Party. Initially, the Dawah Party at least theoretically to, until now, it's not a sectarian party. Like Hezbollah, they're not technically a communitarian sectarian party. They're Islamist party. Indeed, their political ideology was shaped by the Muslim Brothers. However, their main support was Shia. This is where you want to recruit people. And their religious school or madhab is Shia Jafari. You have now authoritarianism on the top and mobilization from below, creating certain dynamics that, in my view, begin to activate sectarian relations and boundaries in the case of Iraq. From the top and from below, leading to what I call in the paper regime erosion in Iraq. Ultimately, the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam invaded Iran not because Khomeini actually constituted an external threat. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran because he was scared that the revolution could spread to Iraq. Iran-Iraq war, invasion of Kuwait, sanctions, and then ultimately, by that time, the Iraqi social fabric had was totally broken, divided, and when the Americans and a coalition of other forces invaded Iraq in 2003, the regime was more or less dead. And those who opposed the regime had already established their own political visions, especially the Kurds, Kurdish movements, and especially the Shiite movements. And when the regime fell, they came forth to realize their own political visions, obliging the slightly confused and angry Sunnis of Iraq of establishing their own vision. And that brings us to the constitutional system in Iraq. More or less, the constitution in Iraq is similar to the case of Lebanon. And the dynamics that emerge are also similar, wanting to incorporate everyone, but Iraq faced a tough geopolitical situation. At the heart of the Middle East, where various countries fought and continue to fight over Iraq, making the process, the transition to constitutional politics and democracy indeed, a very tough one. And what you've seen in the last few months are two conclusions from this long process of state formation. One, people who are angry with the muhassasa system or apportionment system, as in the case of Lebanon. And second, geopolitical rivalry over Iraq. I'll stop here and give you 15 or 20 minutes to ask your question. Thank you very much. So, questions? Let's start with her. She's had her on. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I want to have your point of view about Algeria.
Oh,
And
Algeria.
if you think that Algeria is a more close than Iraqi case. Thank you, just this.
The case of Algeria is very different from the case of Iraq. In examining the cases, in comparing the cases, I would begin to look at specific factors. Look at the process of state formation in Algeria. It's quite different. The geopolitical factor in in Algeria is very different from that of Iraq. The social composition within Algeria is quite different. Yes, again, it depends how you construct the Amazigh and others. There was a process of Arabization in the case of Algeria. I wouldn't say it's as a divided state as Iraq or Syria are. The process of gaining independence in the case of Algeria it first contributed to establishing a strong national identity, built on the memory of fighting colonialism, but that war of independence established a regime type. The same factors you can install, if you want, in the case of Algeria and follow a different trajectory. It established a different regime type. Authoritarian, pan-Arabist regime. So the actual conflict then elevated to the ideological and political one between the Arab nationalists and the Islamists. And that's more similar to the case of Egypt and Tunisia than it is to Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. Another factor that contributed to the consolidation of the Algerian state is the role of oil and income from oil. All contributing, or if you want, fomenting the seeds to the civil war that took place in the 1990s, and it largely was an ideological war between two visions over the national identity and the state in Algeria. The Islamists and the Arab nationalists, stroke secular, or non-Islamist, let's call it that way. And that's more or less, this process has set the grounds to the changes that are taking place in Algeria now. So in short, it's not easy to compare the two cases, except that they're both rich in natural resources, and they both had Arab nationalist movements. But they have a very different social composition. They're very different when it comes to geopolitical locations. And Algerian foreign policy was very sensitive to external intervention. But it also played a role in not intervening in other countries. Although it's, we consider it to be a middle power in a work we're working on at the moment, or we finished at the moment. So they're quite different. But take into consideration these factors, and then that would help you compare across cases. Tfaddal.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I just have a question regarding, you talked about the process of state formation and deformation. Can you probably tell us a little bit more about how does sectarianism really fit into the process of state deformation, particularly after the Arab Spring, of what happened in many countries where we are witnessing state deformation, particularly in Syria and Libya and Iraq as well to a certain extent. Thank you.
I'll address this question. It's in the paper. And it's in a paper called Back to the Future, the Arab Uprisings and State Reformation. In that paper, I compare Iraq and Syria. But they all come from my initial book on the state. Sorry, I don't like to do this, but they're really related to the work. So, in my case, the process of regime erosion or state deformation did not start with the Arab uprisings. The Arab uprisings, in my view, are the outcome of failed state-building processes in the Arab world. So when does the process start? I'd say it started earlier in both Syria and Iraq. It started sometime in the 50s. It's difficult to govern these countries, let's be honest. You have what Ian Lustig called in his seminal study on this topic. You have two options, either consociational option or control politics. Lebanon pursued the consociational option. It has its advantages and disadvantages. Iraq and Syria were obliged, they didn't probably choose, but they were obliged to enter into this trajectory of control politics. When does it start? Well, it starts early. You have, as I said, a coalition of forces that came to rule over these countries, and they were fighting one another. Then, if you are in a broad coalition, generally speaking, secular, progressive, nationalist with various colors, then how do you identify the initial divides? First, it was a conflict between the Arab nationalist movement and the communists. They get rid of the communists. Then the Arab nationalists begin to fight one another. It's really a war for survival in Iraq and Syria. Then you have the Arab nationalist rulings. But then the Baathists enter into conflicts with the Nasrites. And Nasser was quite influential. He wanted certain segments to be ruling these countries, and the Baathists wanted, they had their own ideological framework. They get rid of the Nasserites, and then the Baathists begin to fight one another. Here you begin to see the emergence of sectarian dividing lines. Whether it's a correlation or causation, it's open for interpretation. I'm not making any strong points, but you begin to see a group of officers emerging in the Syrian case that come from the minorities. And then the minorities begin to get rid of one another. And then you're left with two. Hafiz al-Assad, and help me with the names, guys. Hafiz al-Assad and Salah Jdid. Thank you very much. Both Alawites, both more or less contrarian. But even in this process, the party and ideology were quite important. Salah Jdid was ideologically on the left. Hafiz al-Assad was your centrist, pragmatic leader. He realized the disastrous outcomes of the 1967 war and didn't want to enter into ideological conflicts with the Gulf states. Salah Jdid was your typical socialist who was ready to ally himself with the Soviet Union. So the ideology mattered, huh? The political party mattered, but then you had what, in my view, in the end mattered, was who monopolizes coercion. And Hafiz al-Assad managed to do this quietly. He led the ideologues and politicians to debate politics, and then he captured it at a specific time, and then he set his own political system. By that time, you had already established angry segments within Syria. But no one would necessarily say, I'm Sunni sectarian. But the Muslim Brotherhood presented a kind of mobilization of who? The Sunnis. They can't mobilize the Christians or Druze. The Dawah cannot actually monopolize the Christians of Iraq. So it had to rely on its own base. So it's easy to accuse them of sectarianism. In Iraq, you had a similar process leading to the tribe, more or less, Tikriti tribe, controlling the party and through that controlling the state. And then you had Saddam Hussein getting rid of his own uncle, paternal uncle. Imagine where things would reach in both countries. And establishing himself as the leader of the country by the end of 1970s. Saddam Hussein, if you look at his specific political trajectory, you'd see that he activated all kinds of identities in Iraq to remain in power. Activate sectarian identities, tribal identities, ideological identities, religious identity, you name it. And in the process, you have regimes erosion. Why? Because you're monopolizing power, you're excluding major segments in society, and you've already activated sectarian identities, giving, in both Syria and Iraq, various segments this space to organize and mobilize on sectarian or religious or political or ethnic levels. So in the case of Iraq, by the early 1990s, Iraq had collapsed as a state. State had already deformed. And then you had groups, more or less, fighting. But what kept Saddam Hussein in power in 1990, 1991, was the American intervention. In the case of Syria, by 2011, do you find this very surprising? Look at the trajectory of Syria. Why would what appeared then to be a strong state called Syria, why would it suddenly deform in a few months, and then you have the regime losing its power over or control over various areas? Well, in my simple answer, the process started early on. What made sectarianism very exposed is, of course, the uprisings. But it wasn't necessarily absent before that. It was always there. And look at Ba'athist literature, look at Muslim Brotherhood literature, and you see it. So the Arab uprising basically made these groups more conscious of their identity, and they were willing, especially the Shiites in the region, now they're willing to express their identity without fear. That's not, as many people would suggest, that's not a manipulation or instrumentalization. That's actually pride in one's own identity. The feeling and the idea is that we've been repressed for many centuries, and that's the time. I know we've got them. Thank you. Of course, we can talk about this more. I'll address your point regarding March 14, and or we can leave it until your talk. So just to give others. Any questions? We still have 5 minutes. I think I've already gone beyond the time. I stole your coffee break. تفضل.
Thanks, Adham, for this fascinating presentation. One question about the positioning of the military institution or the communitarian constructivism of or the sectarian constructivism of the military formations and the coercive apparatus in the Arab authoritarian regimes, because I feel there is underestimation of the building of the coercive apparatus, and while only focusing on the sectarian and identity lines. Where would you position these from each other?
Let me quickly address this. In both cases, in all processes of state formation throughout the Arab world, and you could argue in the Third World, one way to dominate and establish a state is to control the coercive forces. Whether you're a monarchical family in the Gulf or whether you're a Ba'athist in Syria, you have to do this. And with time, people like Hafiz al-Assad and Saddam Hussein have gotten really good at it. Why? Because they came after a process of various coups d'etats. So you have to control this factor, but that doesn't only explain. So you do have to put your own people and relatives and ideological allies in key aspects. That's what kept the Syrian regime, not necessarily the army, intact for most of the time, and the Iraqi army. But both armies weren't necessarily built on a small elite or a small minority elite, because the rest of the army was ideology matters. How would you explain that the majority of the Iraqi army fighting Iran was Shia? How do you explain that until now in Syria you have Sunnis fighting for Assad? Well, ideology matters, whether it's Arab ideology, Arab nationalist ideology, or simply being a Syrian or Iraqi. But also what matters is having a salary. You know, why would you give up a salary and a stable life to something that is not necessarily clear? Maybe they would have. You remember in the case of Syria, in the beginning of the uprising, you had people defecting. What kept Assad in power is the external factor. What removed Saddam Hussein from power is the external factor. So again, the best way to analyze and understand this case is to think about a configuration of factors. How do different factors configure to establish a specific outcome? Yes, we still have two quick questions. I don't want to take more time. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I hope we have a chance to talk about it, I don't know, during lunch or over coffee. But I do have a few questions. They're not questions, they're like cry for help as a scholar studying sectarianism. I'm just curious to know your opinion as a scholar studying this topic. How do you conceptualize the term sectarian? Do you give it a negative connotation? For example, when you say sectarian groups or sectarian communities, does that mean these groups are, you know, act in negative sectarian terms? And if yes or no, and if so, how do you conceptualize then the term sectarianist? I'm going through this dilemma because again, I've talked about this a few times. The other area that I come from is race and ethnicity, and these terms are, clear in that literature. So we have like race, racial groups, and when you say racial groups, you don't mean these people are racist, But when you say racist, it's a negative connotations, and I'm wondering if it's the same thing in here.
Your first question is an excellent one, and I refer to this as the S word for some. As scholars, in my very humble opinion, if you begin to say sectarianism is wrong, that blinds you to understand sectarianism properly. If you say sectarianism is right, that also blinds you. In the end, you're dealing with a phenomenon. As scholars, we need this distance. Some people don't believe that you could establish the distance. Fair enough. We could discuss it. I believe you could establish distance. You can't understand Shia rise in the region based on this specific or simple instrumentalization of. Sometimes you have people who are secular and leftists who also come from this high moral ground, who believe they could simply dismiss people or certain groups just because they're sectarian. Well, that doesn't explain why they are sectarian to start with. So you really need to ask these important questions. And then it's really up to people and societies decide how they want to organize their political life, not us as scholars. There's this political. You're right, it's different with racism. It is quite different. But if you think of sectarianism, that sometimes it's about a group of people whose identity was always smashed and repressed, Sunnis in Syria or Shias in Iraq, then you really need to start addressing this grievance before demonizing them as simply sectarian. So the question is, and that's even to the papers I've read and the talks I've had, the starting point is, what is your research question? Unless you address this and unless it's clearly articulated, we will get lost in this sea of sectarian studies, or whatever you want to call it. And the last question. No? That's it then. Thank you very much.